The first stars began to peek through the cotton candy clouds as Bubbles wiggled her pink-tipped ears and hopped along the familiar path through the candy forest. This was her favorite time of day, when the world transformed from the bright cheerfulness of afternoon into something softer, something magical. The honeydew leaves on the peppermint bark trees caught the fading sunlight and shimmered like tiny mirrors, each one reflecting fragments of the changing sky. The air smelled of vanilla and wild strawberries, with just a hint of cinnamon carried on the evening breeze. Bubbles paused at the edge of the fizzy lemonade river, watching the gentle bubbles rise and pop in rhythmic patterns that seemed almost like a song. Her fluffy white fur rippled in the breeze as she tilted her head, listening to the forest, settling into its nighttime routine. Somewhere in the distance, a sugar cricket began its evening chirp, and the sound made her feel warm and content deep in her bunny heart. The sky above was putting on its most spectacular show. Ribbons of lavender stretched across the horizon, blending seamlessly into bands of soft peach that melted into rose gold near the tree line. Bubbles had seen many sunsets in the candy forest, but tonight felt different somehow. There was a tingling in the air, a sense that something wonderful was about to happen, though she could not quite explain what made her feel this way. She hopped along the riverbank, her paws making soft padding sounds on the path of crushed sugar crystals. The peppermint bark trees grew thicker here, their trunks striped in red and white spirals that seemed to glow faintly in the dimming light. Between their roots, patches of gummy moss grew in jewel tones of emerald and sapphire, soft as velvet beneath her feet. Bubbles loved how the forest changed with each season, how new surprises appeared in familiar places, as if the woods themselves were alive and playful. As she rounded a bend where a particularly large caramel boulder sat beside the path, Bubbles noticed something she had never seen before. A cotton candy cloud bush, its wispy pink and blue tendrils swaying gently, despite the absence of wind, grew in a small clearing just off the main trail. The bush seemed to pulse with a soft inner light, and Bubbles felt drawn to it as if an invisible thread connected her heart to whatever lay beneath its sugary branches. She approached slowly, her nose twitching with curiosity. The cotton candy strands parted easily as she nudged them aside with her velvet nose. And there, nestled in a bed of spun sugar, lay the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. It was a gumdrop, but unlike any gumdrop she had encountered in all her explorations of the candy forest. This one glowed with an opalescent sheen, its surface shifting through colors that had no names, somewhere between moonlight and mother of pearl, with hints of aurora borealis dancing across its translucent surface. Bubbles sat back on her haunches, mesmerized. The gumdrop was about the size of a large acorn, perfectly round and smooth, and it seemed to hum with a gentle energy that made the air around it shimmer. She leaned forward, extending her pink nose toward the mysterious object, hesitating for just a moment before making contact. The instant her nose touched the gumdrop's surface, a sensation unlike anything she had ever experienced flooded through her body. It was warm, but not hot, tingly, but not uncomfortable, like drinking hot cocoa on a winter evening or lying in a patch of sunshine on a spring afternoon. The warmth spread from her nose, through her whiskers, down her neck, and throughout her entire fluffy body, until even the tips of her pink ears felt alive with pleasant energy. The gumdrop began to glow brighter, and suddenly Bubbles understood. This was no ordinary piece of candy. This was magic, real, true magic, and it was offering itself to her, sharing its gift with a willing heart. Images flooded her mind, bubbles of impossible size and beauty, floating through the air like liquid rainbows, each one containing something precious and peaceful. She saw herself blowing these bubbles, creating them with her own breath, sending them dancing through the twilight air. Without quite knowing how she knew what to do, Bubbles took a deep breath of the sweet forest air. She could taste vanilla and honey, peppermint and wild berries, all mixing together in her lungs. Then, possessing her lips in a small circle, she exhaled gently toward the space in front of her. A bubble began to form, but it was enormous, as large as Bubbles herself, and it shimmered with every color imaginable. The surface of the bubble reflected the twilight sky, the peppermint trees, the fizzy river, all swirled together in a moving tapestry of light and color. But more than that, the bubble hummed. It sang a soft, wordless melody that seemed to resonate with the very heartbeat of the forest. Bubbles watched in wonder as her creation floated upward, rising slowly through the air with a grace that made her heart swell. The bubble caught the last rays of the setting sun and transformed them into a light show of spectacular beauty. Prisms of light danced across the clearing, painting the cotton candy bush and the surrounding trees in shifting patterns of brilliance. But as the bubble drifted higher, Bubbles noticed something even more extraordinary. Within the bubble's iridescent surface, images were forming. She could see glimpses of peaceful scenes, a meadow of soft grass swaying in a gentle breeze, a quiet pond reflecting a full moon, a cozy burrow lined with the softest moss and filled with warm, golden light. These were not memories, exactly, but something more. They were possibilities, dreams, peaceful adventures waiting to be experienced. The bubble floated for what seemed like a long time, though in the candy forest, time had a way of stretching and bending like warm taffy. Finally, it drifted toward a branch of a nearby peppermint tree and touched it gently. Instead of popping with a harsh sound, the bubble dissolved into a shower of tiny sparkles that rained down like sugar dust, each sparkle humming its own tiny note before fading into the evening air. Bubbles felt her heart racing with excitement and joy. She took another breath and blew again, this time creating 3 smaller bubbles that orbited each other in a graceful dance. Each bubble showed different peaceful images. One displayed a field of flowers swaying in unison. Another showed clouds drifting across a serene sky. And the third revealed a family of fireflies creating patterns of light in the darkness. As the evening deepened and the first stars grew brighter overhead, Bubbles experimented with her newfound gift. She discovered that the size of the bubble depended on how much breath she used, that the images within them reflected her own feelings and thoughts, and that each bubble carried with it a sense of peace and contentment that lingered even after the bubble had dissolved. She created a bubble as small as a dewdrop, which showed a single flower petal floating on still water. She blew a bubble so large it nearly filled the clearing, and within it she saw an entire dreamscape of rolling hills covered in soft moss, with a path winding through them toward a horizon that glowed with promise. The opalescent gumdrop sat quietly in its nest of spun sugar, its glow now softer but still present, as if it were smiling at her discovery. Bubbles understood that this magic was meant to be shared, meant to bring peace and wonder to the world. The bubbles she created were more than just beautiful. They were portals to tranquility, windows into the calm and gentle places that existed both in the world and within her own heart. As the last light faded from the sky and the candy forest settled into its nighttime symphony of cricket songs and rustling leaves, Bubbles blew one more bubble. This one rose slowly, carrying within it the image of herself in this very moment, a small white bunny with pink-tipped ears, discovering magic in a twilight clearing, her heart full of wonder and peace. The bubble floated upward toward the emerging stars, and Bubbles knew that her evening adventure was only beginning. The trail of sparkling sugar dust appeared at Bubbles' feet like an invitation written in starlight. Each tiny crystal caught the moonbeams filtering through the peppermint trees, creating a path that seemed to whisper promises of friendship and discovery. Bubbles felt her heart flutter with anticipation as she began to follow the glittering trail, her paws leaving soft impressions in the sweet dust that sparkled and swirled in her wake. The path led her away from the familiar riverbank and deeper into a part of the candy forest she had never fully explored. Here, the trees were different. Their trunks weren't striped peppermint, but rather smooth caramel, with thick golden syrup drizzled down their bark in artistic swirls that hardened into glossy patterns. The leaves above rustled with a sound like wrapped candies being gently shaken, and the air grew sweeter, filled with the scent of butterscotch and warm toffee. Bubbles hopped carefully between the roots of these camel trees, noticing how the moonlight seemed to make the drizzled syrup glow from within. Tiny fireflies with wings that looked like spun sugar floated between the branches, their lights pulsing in gentle rhythms that matched her heartbeat. The forest floor here was carpeted with what appeared to be crushed graham crackers, soft and golden, releasing a comforting aroma with each step she took. As she rounded a particularly large caramel trunk, Bubbles heard something that made her freeze in place. Giggles. Not just one giggle, but three distinct sounds of merriment. each with its own musical quality. One was high and tinkling like wind chimes. Another was deeper and bubbling like a happy brook. And the third was somewhere in between, warm and rolling like distant thunder on a summer afternoon. Bubbles peeked around the tree trunk and gasped softly at what she saw. 3 small figures were dancing in a circle around a ring of glowing mushrooms, their movements synchronized and joyful. They were unlike any creatures she had encountered in the candy forest before. Each stood no taller than a large pine cone, with round bellies and rosy cheeks that seemed to glow with inner warmth. Their bodies appeared to be made of translucent gumdrops, one ruby red, one emerald green, and one amber gold. And atop each of their heads sat a tiny cap that looked exactly like a miniature mushroom made of crystallized honey. The red gumdrop gnome spotted her first and let out a delighted squeal. All 3 stopped their dancing and turned to face her, their faces breaking into the widest, most welcoming smiles Bubbles had ever seen. Their eyes sparkled like sugar crystals, and their expressions held nothing but pure joy at her arrival. The red gnome stepped forward, his honey mushroom cap tilting slightly as he bowed with exaggerated formality. His voice, when he spoke, was the high, tinkling one Bubbles had heard, bright and cheerful as morning bells. He introduced himself as Pip, and his words tumbled out in an excited rush, explaining that they had been hoping someone would follow their sugar dust trail tonight. The green gnome, whose voice was the bubbling brook sound, introduced himself as Pop. He was slightly rounder than Pip, with a belly that jiggled when he laughed, which seemed to be constantly. His crystallized honey cap had tiny ridges that caught the light and threw rainbow patterns across the forest floor. The golden gnome, Huff, spoke last in that warm, rolling voice. He moved with a gentle grace that contrasted with his companion's more energetic movements, and his eyes held a wisdom that seemed older than his cheerful demeanor suggested. He explained that they had sensed the awakening of the opalescent gumdrop's magic and knew that someone special must have found it. The 3 gnomes surrounded Bubbles, their giggles creating a symphony of happiness that made her feel instantly at ease. They took turns touching her soft fur with their tiny gumdrop hands, marveling at how fluffy she was, and Pip even attempted to climb onto her back before Pop gently reminded him of their manners. Puff suggested they should properly welcome their new friend, and all 3 gnomes nodded enthusiastically in agreement, with gestures that were both graceful and comical. The gnomes invited Bubbles to follow them. They led her through the grove of camel trees to a spot she would have walked right past without noticing, a cleverly hidden entrance beneath the largest tree in the grove. This tree was extraordinary, its trunk not caramel, but rather a massive spiral of rainbow-striped lollipop, its surface smooth and gleaming in the moonlight. The tree's roots created natural archways and tunnels, and it was into one of these that the gnomes disappeared, beckoning for Bubbles to follow. She had to crouch low to fit through the entrance, but once inside, the space opened into a cozy hollow that took her breath away. The walls were lined with honeycomb, each hexagonal cell glowing with soft amber light. Shelves carved into the walls held an array of treasures, polished candy stones, dried flower petals pressed between sheets of clear sugar glass, tiny books bound in fruit leather, and jars filled with what appeared to be captured starlight. In the center of the hollow sat a low table made from a slice of giant jawbreaker, its layers of color creating a natural work of art. Around the table were cushions stuffed with the softest marshmallow fluff, and hanging from the ceiling were lanterns made from hollowed out gumdrops that cast colored light throughout the space. The gnomes bustled about with practiced efficiency, preparing refreshments for their guest. Pop disappeared through a small doorway and returned carrying a tray with 4 acorn cups, each one polished to a shine and filled with steaming liquid that smelled of family and honey. Pip arranged a plate of tiny cookies that appeared to be made from crystallized flower petals, while Puff lit additional gumdrop lanterns to make the space even more welcoming. Bubbles settled onto the largest marshmallow cushion, and the gnomes arranged themselves around the table, their faces glowing with excitement. Pop pushed one of the acorn cups toward her, and when she took a tentative sip, warmth spread through her body. The chamomile nectar was perfect, not too sweet, with hints of vanilla and a subtle floral note that made her feel peaceful and content. As they sipped their nectar, the gnomes began to share their stories. Puff spoke of the marshmallow meadows, a place beyond the licorice hills that few in the candy forest had ever seen. He described fields that stretched as far as the eye could see, covered in marshmallows of every size and color. These weren't ordinary marshmallows, he explained, but special ones that glowed like moonlight and emitted a gentle warmth that could be felt even from a distance. Hip added details with his characteristic enthusiasm, describing how the marshmallows were so soft that walking through the meadows felt like floating on clouds. He spoke of how they grew in clusters like flowers, some tall and cylindrical, others round and plump, creating a landscape that looked like something from a dream. Pop contributed his own observations about the sounds of the marshmallow meadows, how the wind moving through the fields created a gentle whooshing sound like distant waves, and how at night the glowing marshmallows hummed with a frequency so low it could only be felt rather than heard, creating a sensation of deep peace in anyone who visited. But it was Puff who shared the most important lesson, the philosophy that the gnomes lived by and wanted to pass on to Bubbles. He explained that worries were like bubbles, beautiful in their own way, interesting to observe, but never meant to be held onto. Just as bubbles were meant to float away and pop harmlessly into the air, worries were meant to be acknowledged and then released, not carried around like heavy stones. The concept resonated deeply with Bubbles, especially given her recent discovery of the bubble magic. Pip suggested they demonstrate this philosophy practically, and all 3 gnomes nodded eagerly. They explained that Bubbles could use her newfound gift not just to create beautiful bubbles, but to create worry bubbles, each one carrying a small concern or anxious thought that could then drift away and dissolve into sparkles. Bubbles thought about the small worries she sometimes carried. Concern about whether she was exploring too far from home, anxiety about whether she would always find her way back, uncertainty about changes in the forest. These weren't large fears, but they were there, small weights she carried without really noticing them. Following the gnome's gentle encouragement, Bubbles took a deep breath and thought about one of her worries. Then she exhaled slowly, creating a small bubble that shimmered with a slightly different quality than her earlier ones. This bubble had a faint cloudiness within it, as if it contained a tiny wisp of fog. As it floated upward in the cozy hollow, Bubbles felt something shift inside her, a lightness as if a small burden had been lifted. The bubble drifted toward the honeycomb ceiling and, upon touching it, dissolved into sparkles that rained down like sugar dust. The moment it disappeared, Bubbles felt noticeably lighter, more relaxed. The gnomes clapped their tiny hands in delight, their giggles filling the hollow with joy. Encouraged by this success, Bubbles created another worry bubble, this one carrying her concern about being alone sometimes. As it floated away and popped, she realized that she was never truly alone. The forest was full of friends she hadn't met yet, like these wonderful gnomes. Another bubble carried her anxiety about the unknown, and when it dissolved, she understood that the unknown was simply another word for adventure waiting to happen. With each worry bubble she created and released, Bubbles felt herself becoming lighter, more peaceful, more present in the moment. The gnomes watched with warm approval, occasionally offering gentle words of encouragement or sharing their own experiences with releasing worries. The moon had climbed higher in the velvet sky by the time Bubbles bid farewell to her new friends, her heart full of warmth and her spirit lighter than dandelion fluff. The gumdrop gnomes had walked her to the edge of their caramel grove, each one giving her a tiny hug that felt like being wrapped in sunshine. Puff had whispered one last piece of wisdom in her ear, that the most beautiful discoveries often waited just beyond the next bend in the path. And with that gentle encouragement, Bubbles continued her moonlit adventure. The trail before her now was different from any she had traveled before. Instead of the familiar sugar crystals or graham cracker dust, this path was paved with crushed peppermint stones that gleamed like scattered opals in the moonlight. Each stone had been worn smooth by countless seasons, their surfaces catching and reflecting light in ways that made the path seem to glow from within. The peppermint scent rose with each hot Bubbles took cool and refreshing, clearing her mind and making her whiskers tingle with anticipation. The path wound through parts of the candy forest that seemed to exist in a perpetual state of twilight, where the boundaries between day and night blurred into something magical and in between. Trees here had bark that looked like twisted ribbons of licorice, their branches reaching upward in graceful arcs that created natural archways overhead. Hanging from these branches were what appeared to be crystallized dewdrops, each one containing a tiny spark of light that pulsed gently, like the breathing of the forest itself. As Bubbles followed the winding peppermint path, the air began to change. It grew sweeter, filled with fragrances she couldn't quite identify, hints of wild strawberry, mixed with something floral, vanilla notes dancing with traces of citrus, all blending together into a perfume that made her feel as if she were walking through a dream. The temperature was perfect, neither too warm nor too cool, just the gentle embrace of a perfect evening. The path curved around a massive boulder made entirely of rock candy, its facets throwing rainbow light in every direction. And suddenly Bubbles found herself at the entrance to a garden, unlike anything she had ever imagined. She stopped, her pink-tipped ears standing straight up in wonder, her breath catching in her throat at the beauty before her. The garden stretched out in a series of terraced levels, each one over flowers that seemed to be made of spun sugar and crystallized honey. But it wasn't the flowers that made Bubbles gasp. It was what filled the air above them. Butterflies, hundreds of candy butterflies, each one a masterpiece of confectionery art, their wings catching the moonlight and transforming it into a display of moving color that defied description. The butterflies' wings were crafted from the most delicate spun sugar, so thin they were nearly transparent, reinforced with frames of fruit-flavored gelatin that gave them structure and color. Some had wings of cherry red that faded to orange at the edges. Others displayed gradients of lime, green, melting into lemon, yellow, and still others showed combinations of colors that nature itself had never conceived, lavender blending into mint, peach flowing into periwinkle, rose gold merging with seafoam, green. But these butterflies weren't simply beautiful. They were alive with grace and purpose. They moved through the air in patterns that seemed choreographed by some unseen conductor, their flight paths weaving together and apart in designs that created temporary tapestries of color and light. Some flew in spirals that rose toward the stars. Others traced figure eights that looped and crossed with mathematical precision, and still others simply hovered in place, their wings beating so rapidly. They created a soft humming sound that resonated with the peaceful pulse of the night. Bubbles took a tentative hop into the garden, and immediately the butterflies seemed to notice her presence. Their patterns shifted, flowing toward her like a river of living color. She felt no fear, only wonder as they began to circle around her, their wing beats creating gentle breezes that ruffled her fur and carried with them the scent of fruit and flowers. One butterfly separated itself from the swirling mass and approached Bubbles directly. This one was larger than the others, with wings that seemed to contain their own source of light. As it drew closer, Bubbles could see that its wings were extraordinary. They shifted between colors as it moved, flowing from raspberry pink to blueberry blue and back again. with hints of grape purple appearing in the transitions. The wings caught the moonlight and scattered it into tiny rainbows that danced across Bubbles' white fur. The butterfly landed gently on Bubbles' nose, so light she barely felt its presence. Its wings continued their slow, mesmerizing color shifts, and Bubbles found herself staring into tiny eyes that sparkled with intelligence and kindness. Without words, she understood that this butterfly was special, a leader among its kind, and that it had been waiting for her. The butterfly lifted off from her nose and performed a graceful loop in the air before hovering at eye level. Then, in a voice that sounded like wind chimes played by a summer breeze, it spoke. The butterfly introduced itself as Shimmer, guardian of the candy butterfly garden and keeper of the ancient lullabies that helped the forest sleep peacefully each night. Shimmer explained that the butterflies had sensed Bubbles' journey through the forest, had felt the release of her worry bubbles and the lightness they had brought to her spirit. They had been preparing a special welcome, a gift of song and movement that they shared only with those whose hearts were open to the deeper magic of the candy forest. At some invisible signal from Shimmer, the other butterflies began to arrange themselves around Bubbles in a formation that took her breath away. They created a spiral that started at ground level and rose upward in a graceful helix, each butterfly positioned perfectly to create a living tunnel of color and light. The spiral rotated slowly, and as it turned, the butterflies began to sing. The sound was unlike anything Bubbles had ever heard. It wasn't quite music and wasn't quite words, but something in between, a melodious expression of pure peace and contentment. The lullaby spoke of drifting on vanilla breezes, of floating through clouds made of whipped cream dreams, of resting on pillows, of soft moonlight while stars sang overhead. Each butterfly contributed its own note to the harmony, and together they created a symphony that seemed to resonate not just in Bubbles' ears, but in her very bones, in the rhythm of her heartbeat, in the gentle rise and fall of her breathing. Shimmer flew close to Bubbles' ear and whispered that she should move with the spiral, should let the rhythm of the song guide her movements. Bubbles began to hop, but not in her usual quick, energetic way. Instead, she found herself moving slowly, deliberately, each hop matching the peaceful pulse of the butterfly's song. Her movements became a dance, fluid and graceful, as if she had always known these steps, but had simply forgotten them until this moment. The spiral of butterflies began to move through the garden, and Bubbles followed, her hops synchronized with their flight. They led her past beds of sugar flowers that released gentle fragrances as she passed, through archways formed by vines of twisted licorice, adorned with blossoms made of crystallized fruit, and around fountains where liquid starlight bubbled up from hidden springs and cascaded down in glittering streams. As they moved, the butterflies continued their lullaby, and new verses emerged. They sang of the forest's heartbeat, the slow and steady rhythm that connected all living things. They sang of the wisdom found in stillness, of the strength that came from gentleness, of the courage required to be soft in a world that sometimes seemed hard. Their words, if they could be called words, painted pictures in Bubbles' mind of peaceful meadows and quiet streams, of soft nests and warm burrows, of all the safe and comfortable places in the world where one too could rest without fear. Shimmer flew in loops around Bubbles' head, its color-shifting wings creating patterns of light that seemed to match the rhythm of the song. The butterfly taught her to breathe in time with the music, to let each inhale fill her with the peace of the garden, and each exhale release any remaining tension from her body. With each breath, Bubbles felt herself sinking deeper into a state of profound relaxation, yet she remained alert and aware, present in every magical moment. The procession wound deeper into the garden, and the landscape began to change. The sugar flowers grew taller, here, their petals forming natural canopies overhead that filtered the moonlight into soft, dappled patterns. The air grew even sweeter, and Bubbles noticed that the ground beneath her paws had become softer, covered in what felt like the finest spun sugar, cushioning each hop and making her movements even more gentle and deliberate. Finally, the butterflies led her to the heart of the garden, where a crystalline pond lay perfectly still, its surface like polished glass. The pond was fed by a small waterfall of liquid starlight that tumbled over rock made of clear sugar crystal, creating a sound like distant bells. Around the pond's edge grew flowers that glowed from within, their light pulsing in time with the butterfly's lullaby. Shimmer guided Bubbles to the very edge of the pond and encouraged her to look into its depths. The reflection in the pond didn't show what was, but what could be. Instead of seeing herself, a small white bunny with pink-tipped ears standing in a magical garden, she saw visions of dreams yet to come. In the liquid starlight's reflection, Bubbles watched herself floating through gentle skies, painted in pastels, drifting on currents of warm air that smelled of cinnamon and honey. She saw herself resting on clouds that were soft as the finest cotton candy, clouds that molded themselves perfectly to her body and rocked her gently like a cradle. She witnessed scenes of peaceful adventures, exploring meadows where every blade of grass sang its own quiet song, discovering caves filled with glowing crystals that hummed with ancient melodies, meeting creatures of impossible gentleness who shared their wisdom through touch and presence rather than words. The butterflies continued their lullaby, and now their song spoke directly to what Bubbles saw in the pond. They sang of the power of dreams, of how the visions we hold in our hearts could shape the reality we experience. They explained that the pond showed not predictions of the future, but possibilities, peaceful adventures that awaited her if she remained open to them, if she continued to move through the world with the gentle rhythm she had learned tonight. The butterfly's lullaby faded into the gentlest whisper as shimmer led bubbles away from the crystalline pond, their wings creating one final cascade of raspberry and blueberry light before the candy butterflies dispersed into the night like scattered jewels. Bubbles felt their song, still resonating in her chest, a warm hum that matched the peaceful rhythm of her heartbeat. The peppermint path continued beyond the garden, winding deeper into the ancient heart of the candy forest, where the oldest and wisest creatures made their homes. The trees here were different from any Bubbles had encountered on her journey. These were the grandmother and grandfather trees, their trunks thick and gnarled with age, their bark textured like honeycomb that had been weathered by countless seasons. Hanging from their branches were lanterns, unlike the gumdrop lights she had seen before. These were made of pure honeycomb, each hexagonal cell filled with golden light that seemed to breathe, growing brighter and dimmer in a slow, meditative rhythm that reminded Bubbles of gentle breathing during sleep. The air beneath these ancient trees felt different, heavier, somehow, but not in an uncomfortable way. It was the weight of wisdom, of stories accumulated over generations, of secrets whispered between roots that ran deeper than anyone could imagine. The scent here was rich and complex, honey and beeswax mixed with something darker and more mysterious, a fragrance that made Bubbles think of cozy libraries and warm blankets and the feeling of being completely safe. As she hopped along the path, her paws now moving in the slow, deliberate rhythm the butterflies had taught her, Bubbles noticed that the sounds of the forest had changed. The sugar crickets' chirping had faded, replaced by a deeper silence that wasn't empty, but rather full of presence, full of attention, full of something ancient watching and waiting with patient kindness. Then she heard it, a sound that made her stop mid-hop and tilt her head to listen more carefully. It was a voice, deep and resonant, speaking words she couldn't quite make out, but that carried a tone of such warmth and wisdom that she felt immediately drawn toward it. And something that she felt, the voice seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, echoing softly through the honeycomb lanterns and reverberating in the hollow spaces between the ancient trees. Bubbles followed the sound, her pink-tipped ears swiveling to catch every nuance of that remarkable voice. The path led her to the largest tree she had ever seen, a massive toffee tree whose trunk was so wide that 10 bunnies hopping nose to tail couldn't have circled it. The bark was the color of rich caramel, smooth in some places and deliciously cracked in others, with veins of darker toffee running through it like rivers on a map. The tree's branches spread out in all directions, creating a canopy so dense that the moonlight filtering through appeared as scattered coins of silver light. Perched on one of the lower branches, positioned perfectly so that a beam of moonlight illuminated him like a natural spotlight, sat the most magnificent owl Bubbles had ever imagined. He was crafted entirely of chocolate, the finest, richest chocolate that seemed to absorb and reflect light simultaneously. His body was made of smooth milk chocolate, that gleamed in the lantern light, while his wings showed layers of different chocolates, dark, milk, and white, creating natural patterns that looked like feathers, but were actually the swirls and folds of tempered confection. But it was the owl's eyes that truly captured Bubbles' attention. They were large and perfectly round, made of swirled caramel that seemed to contain depths impossible for their size. The caramel swirled in patterns that moved slowly, hypnotically, creating spirals that drew the eye inward toward a center that glowed with warm, amber light. Looking into those eyes, Bubbles felt seen in a way she had never experienced before. Not judged, not examined, but simply witnessed with complete acceptance and understanding. The owl's feathers, for though they were chocolate, they were still distinctly feathers, ruffled slightly as he shifted his position on the branch. The movement released a cloud of the finest cocoa powder that drifted down like brown snow, and the scent that reached Bubbles was heavenly, pure cocoa with hints of vanilla and a touch of cinnamon, warm and comforting and utterly delicious. The owl spoke, and his voice was the one Bubbles had been following, deep and soothing, like warm honey being poured slowly into a cup, with undertones that resonated in her chest and made her feel grounded and safe. He introduced himself as Coco, keeper of the toffee tree and guardian of the forest's deepest wisdom. He explained that he had been expecting her, had felt her journey through the forest like ripples in a pond, and had been preparing riddles that would help her understand the final lessons of the night. Bubbles settled onto her haunches at the base of the great tree, looking up at Coco with wide eyes full of curiosity and trust. The chocolate owl shifted again, and more cocoa powder drifted down, settling on Bubbles' white fur like a dusting of magic. Coco explained that riddles were not meant to confuse, but to illuminate, that the best questions were those that made you look inside yourself for answers you already possessed but had forgotten you knew. The owl's caramel eyes swelled more rapidly for a moment, then settled into a gentle, steady pattern. He asked his first riddle, his voice dropping even lower, becoming almost a vibration that Bubbles felt rather than heard. What is sweeter than candy, but costs nothing at all? Bubbles thought carefully, her nose twitching as she considered. She thought about all the sweet things she had encountered in the candy forest. The gumdrop, the chamomile, nectar, the sugar flowers in the butterfly garden. But the riddle said sweeter than candy, which meant it had to be something else entirely. She thought about her journey tonight, about the moments that had made her heart feel fullest. The answer came to her suddenly, clearly, like a star appearing in a darkening sky. Kindness, she whispered, and even though her voice was small, it seemed to echo through the space beneath the toffee tree. Coco's eyes brightened, the caramel swirls glowing with approval. He nodded slowly, his chocolate feathers rustling with the movement. He explained that kindness was indeed the sweetest thing in any world, that it cost nothing to give, but was worth more than all the treasures in the forest. The gumdrop gnomes had shown her kindness by welcoming her into their home. The butterflies had shown her kindness through their lullaby, and she had shown kindness to herself by taking this journey and allowing herself to experience wonder and peace. The owl settled more comfortably on his branch, and Bubbles noticed that beneath him the wood had been worn smooth by countless nights of perching in exactly that spot. Coco asked his second riddle, his voice taking on a quality that seemed to float on the air like dandelion seeds. What is lighter than a bubble but holds everything? This riddle was trickier, and Bubbles found herself thinking in circles. What could be lighter than a bubble? Bubbles were already so light, they floated away on the slightest breeze. And yet something lighter still, something that could hold everything. She thought about the bubbles she had created, about the images and feelings they had contained. She thought about the visions in the crystalline pond, about the possibilities and peaceful adventures she had seen reflected there. Dreams, she said finally, the word emerging with a sense of rightness that made her whiskers tingle. Again, Coco's eyes glowed with warm approval. He spoke of dreams as the lightest things in existence, weighing nothing at all, yet capable of holding entire worlds within them. Dreams could contain adventures that would take lifetimes to live, emotions too vast for waking hours to process, and possibilities that stretched beyond the boundaries of reality itself. The owl explained that the bubbles created were physical manifestations of dreams, that her magic was the ability to make the invisible visible, to give form to the formless. The honeycomb lanterns pulsed with their breathing light, and somewhere in the distance, Bubbles heard the soft hoot of another owl, Coco's call being answered by family or friends in far corners of the forest. The night was growing deeper, the moon climbing toward its zenith, and Bubbles felt a pleasant tiredness beginning to settle into her bones, not the exhaustion of weariness, but the satisfied fatigue of a day well lived and a journey well traveled. Coco asked his third and final riddle, and this time his voice was barely above a whisper, intimate and profound. What grows stronger when shared but never runs out? Bubbles didn't have to think long about this one. The answer seemed to glow in her heart like the honeycomb lanterns glowed in the branches above. She had experienced it throughout her entire journey, with the gnomes, with the butterflies, and now with this wise chocolate owl. Peace, she said softly. Coco's response was a sound that was half hoot, half purr, a noise of such contentment and approval that it made Bubbles' heart swell. The owl spoke of peace as the greatest magic in any world, a force that multiplied when given away, that strengthened both the giver and receiver, and that could never be depleted, no matter how much was shared. He explained that everything Bubbles had learned tonight, releasing worries, moving with gentle rhythm, dreaming of peaceful possibilities, practicing kindness, all of it was in service of creating and maintaining peace, both within herself and in the world around her. As Coco finished speaking, Bubbles heard a new sound, a soft rustling from the other side of the toffee tree. She turned her head and watched as a remarkable creature emerged from the shadows. It was a snake, but unlike any snake she had ever seen. Its body was made of black licorice, twisted and coiled in graceful loops, with a surface that gleamed like polished obsidian in the lantern light. The snake moved with a fluid grace that was mesmerizing to watch, each undulation perfectly controlled, each curve flowing seamlessly into the next. The snake's eyes were small and bright, like tiny red candies, and they regarded Bubbles with gentle curiosity. When it spoke, its voice was barely audible, a whisper that somehow carried clearly through the night air. It introduced itself as Stretch, friend to Coco and teacher of the body's wisdom. Stretch explained that while Coco taught wisdom of the mind and heart, Stretch taught wisdom of the body, how to release tension, how to move with intention, how to prepare oneself for deep and restful sleep. The licorice snake demonstrated by extending its body to an impressive length, stretching out along the ground until it was nearly as long as Bubbles was tall. Then, slowly and deliberately, Stretch began to coil back up, moving with such control that Bubbles could see each individual muscle working beneath the glossy licorice surface. The snake invited Bubbles to try similar movements, adapted for a bunny's body. Stretch guided her through a series of gentle stretches, extending her front legs forward and pressing her chest toward the ground, arching her back upward like a cat waking from sleep, stretching each hind leg backward one at a time, and finally doing a full body stretch that extended from her pink-tipped ears to her fluffy cottontail. With each stretch, Bubbles felt tension she hadn't even known she was carrying begin to release. Her muscles, which had been holding the excitement and wonder of the evening, began to soften and relax. Stretch taught her to breathe with each movement, inhaling as she extended, exhaling as she released, creating a rhythm that matched the pulsing of the honeycomb lanterns and the gentle breathing of the forest itself. Then, Stretch demonstrated the art of curling into a comfortable coil, showing how to position oneself for maximum comfort and security. The snake formed a perfect spiral, its head resting on its own coils, looking utterly peaceful and content. Stretch explained that finding the right position for rest was an art form, that the body knew what it needed if one simply listened. Bubbles felt a deep tiredness settling over her now, the pleasant heaviness of a body ready for sleep. She thanked Coco and Stretch for their wisdom and their kindness, and both creatures responded with gestures of warmth, Coco ruffling his chocolate feathers in a gentle wave, Stretch raising its head in a small bow of acknowledgement. The path home appeared before Bubbles, as if the forest itself was guiding her, the peppermint stones glowing brighter to light her way. She hopped slowly, savoring these final moments of her journey, letting the lessons of the night settle into her heart like seeds being planted in rich soil. The forest seemed to embrace her as she traveled, the trees leaning in, slightly as if offering protection, the breeze carrying scents of vanilla and honey that wrapped around her like a blanket. Finally, Bubbles arrived at her favorite spot in all the candy forest, a small clearing beneath the gumdrop willow, a tree whose branches hung low and were adorned with gumdrops of every color, each one glowing softly in the moonlight. The ground beneath the willow was covered in the softest moss, colored in shades of mint green and lavender, and the air here always smelled of sweet grass and wildflowers. Bubbles positioned herself in the center of the clearing, remembering everything she had learned. She thought about the gnome's lesson about releasing worries, about the butterfly's teaching of gentle rhythm, about Coco's riddles, revealing the sweetness of kindness, the lightness of dreams, and the strength of peace. She remembered Stretch's wisdom about preparing the body for rest. Then, taking a deep breath of the sweet night air, Bubbles blew one final bubble. This one was different from all the others she had created tonight. It grew larger than any before, expanding until it was big enough to surround her completely. The bubble's surface shimmered with every color she had seen on her journey. The opalescent glow of the original gumdrop, the ruby and emerald and amber of the gnomes, the raspberry and blueberry of Shimmer's wings, the rich brown of Coco's chocolate feathers, the glossy black of Stretch's licorice body. But more than colors, the bubble contained moments. Bubbles could see them all reflected in its iridescent surface. The gnome's warm welcome, the butterfly's graceful dance, the wisdom shared beneath the coffee tree. The bubble held not just images, but feelings, the warmth of friendship, the lightness of released worries, the peace of gentle movement, the comfort of being truly seen and accepted. The bubble settled around Bubbles like a nest, its walls becoming and soft, creating a cocoon of shimmering protection. Inside this bubble nest, Bubbles felt completely safe, completely content. Above her, through the bubble's surface, she could see the sugar stars twinkling in the velvet sky, each one pulsing with light that seemed to match her heartbeat. Bubbles curled into the most comfortable position, her body remembering Stretch's teachings. She tucked her pink-tipped ears against her head, curled her fluffy tail around her body, and let her eyes drift closed. The bubble nest glowed gently around her, and she could feel it breathing with her, expanding slightly with each inhale, settling with each exhale. As sleep began to claim her, Bubbles felt gratitude flowing through her heart like warm honey, gratitude for the magic of the opalescent gumdrop, for the friendship of the gnomes, for the beauty of the butterfly's lullaby, for the wisdom of Coco and Stretch. The last thing she was aware of before sleep took her completely was the sensation of floating, of being held by something larger and more loving than she could name. The bubble nest rocked her gently, and somewhere in the distance, she heard the forest singing its own lullaby, the rustle of candy leaves, the bubble of the lemonade river, the soft hooting of chocolate owls, the whisper of licorice snakes, all blending together into a symphony of peace. Bubbles drifted into dreams, Bubbles drifted into dreams, and her dreams were filled with candy-coated adventures, gentle explorations of marshmallow meadows, peaceful flights through vanilla-scented skies, quiet moments of connection with friends, both old and new. In her dreams, she continued to blow bubbles, each one carrying peace and wonder out into the world, each one a gift to the candy forest that had given her so much. The moon watched over her sleeping form, and the stars kept their vigil, and the gumdrop willow's branches swayed gently in the night breeze, creating shadows that danced across the glowing bubble nest. In this moment, in this place, everything was exactly as it should be. Bubbles the bunny slept deeply, peacefully, her heart full of magic and her spirit light as the bubbles she loved to create, dreaming dreams sweeter than any candy in the forest.